Meet Capella, who was unjustly framed for the prince's murder. Betrayed by her ruthless father, she was left to face execution. However, fate granted her a second chance as she was reincarnated as a baby. Now, with burning determination, she vows to exact revenge on her merciless father and unravel the mystery surrounding the prince's death. This story begins. At a table sat a young man and a girl with blue hair, facing each other. The young man turned to the girl and declared that he intended to break off their upcoming engagement. Upon hearing this, the girl's face turned red, and tears welled up in her eyes. With trembling hands, she grabbed her cup of tea, which she promptly threw into the young man's face, causing tea to spill everywhere. Instinctively, he shut his eyes to avoid the impact. Shocked by his sudden announcement, the girl became extremely anxious. Jumping to her feet, she firmly stated that she did not agree with his decision and never would. Then, without another word, she stormed off. Tears continued streaming from the eyes of the Duke's eldest daughter, Capella Axon. The decision to break off the engagement had deeply hurt her. Her fiancé, second Prince Oberon, had been the one to end their engagement, and as the only daughter of the Grand Duke, Capella could not accept such a fate. Conflicted, Capella didn't know if she should tell her father, but she also realized that her father, known as the Reaper of Death, likely wouldn't care about her situation. As she ran away, she encountered a girl who radiated an angelic presence, Yuno. Noticing Capella's tears, Yuno asked what was wrong. Capella, her eyes brimming with tears, stuttered as she began to explain the situation. Without hesitation, Yuno embraced Capella, assuring her that everything would be all right. Capella stood frozen, clearly not expecting the comforting gesture. Yuno then stepped back, gently placing a hand on Capella's head, advising her to speak to Oberon again, confident that he would understand. After considering it, Capella, now smiling through her tears, agreed with Yuno's advice. Grateful, she thanked Yuno and prepared to confront her fiancé once more. Determined, Capella made her way to Oberon's room. She paused at the door before knocking softly, announcing her presence and intention to talk. Receiving no response, she called out his name and, without hesitation, opened the door. What she saw inside left her in shock. She screamed in horror. There, on the floor, sat the prince with a sword embedded in his chest, blood pooling around him. It was clear he didn't have long to live. Suddenly, the door opened again, and a maid entered. Upon seeing the scene, the maid screamed and collapsed to the floor in terror, immediately accusing Capella of the crime. Frantically, Capella tried to defend herself, insisting she had nothing to do with it, but no one listened. The servants called for the guards, and when they arrived, the maid pointed at Capella, instructing them to arrest her. Though Capella continued to protest her innocence, the guards grabbed her, binding her arms tightly behind her back. Out of the corner of her eye, Capella noticed the maids whispering amongst themselves, watching her capture. Just then, familiar footsteps echoed in the corridor, causing her to turn. It was Yuno, wearing a hood. Desperate, Capella shouted for her friend, hoping to get her attention, but Yuno ignored her, walking by as if she hadn't noticed. The guards threw Capella to the ground, warning her not to move. As she lay there, she reached out pitifully towards where Yuno had passed. For a brief moment, Yuno glanced back at Capella with disinterest before lowering her gaze and continuing on her way, leaving Capella utterly confused. Not long after, Capella was brought before the king. His voice thundered as he declared that Capella Axon was sentenced to death for the murder of his son, Prince Oberon. Kneeling before him, her hands bound, Capella cried out, pleading her innocence. As she spoke, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, her father. His gaze was cold and unfeeling, as if he didn't care about his daughter at all. Capella screamed and begged him to intervene, desperately trying to explain that she was not guilty. However, Corvus Axon, the Reaper of Death, looked at her only briefly before turning away. As Capella was dragged to the dungeon, she reflected on her father's indifference. He had never shown any interest in her, not even when she was a child. Though he was her only family, he never once smiled at her. She assumed his coldness was due to his reputation as the Reaper of Death. As Capella neared her death sentence, she realized that such a father would never protect her. When she reached the steps leading to her execution, the guards knocked her down, ordering her to tell her father her last words. Raising her head towards him, she prepared to speak. The main character, Capella, tried to insist that she had done nothing wrong and was innocent, but her father, Corvus, only looked at her with a cold, contemptuous gaze. He said nothing. Even in that moment, as she faced her execution, his expression remained unchanged. The guards were readying the guillotine, the sound of clanking chains echoed through the air, and Corvus, without a word, turned his back on her and walked away. Capella was stunned by her father's behavior, screaming his name with all her strength, but he didn't respond. Frozen in disbelief, she realized that he truly must hate her. As her head slowly rested on the execution stand, her thoughts turned dark. Now, more than anything, she wanted revenge on the father who had never given her the love she deserved. Tears streamed down her face, but just as she resigned herself to her fate, a familiar figure appeared in the crowd. Yuno, her dearest friend, screamed and rushed toward Capella, reaching out her hand. At the same moment, a guard unexpectedly cut the rope binding her. A loud scream rang out, and suddenly, Capella's eyes flew open, red and confused. She had no idea where she was or what had just happened. She found herself in a bright room, sunlight streaming in, and a bird chirping at the window. A man entered the room, opening the door and asking if Capella was awake. As he came closer, she recognized him. It was her father, Corvus, but much younger. He looked surprisingly handsome in his youth. Confused, Capella looked down at her hands and realized they had become small, shockingly small. It finally dawned on her, she had somehow returned to the past, now a baby again. Her father, Corvus, extended his hand toward her, and she looked at him with suspicion, seeing him as the enemy. In a moment of defiance, she grabbed his finger, but instead of anger, Corvus smiled, calling her silly. He even remarked how angelic she looked, though Capella held his finger in her mouth, still filled with hostility. She was confused. Her father's words said one thing, but the feelings she sensed from him were completely different. She was startled to realize that she could somehow hear her father's thoughts. Although he openly stated he would have preferred a son, Capella heard his internal thoughts, which were full of admiration and affection for her. The contrast between his outward coldness and his inner feelings frightened her, and she quickly let go of his finger. Despite his cold exterior, his thoughts revealed that he cared deeply for her, even though he couldn't accept the idea of her being used in a political marriage. Just then, a maid entered the room, and Corvus immediately stiffened. Without a word, he straightened up and left the room, the maid rushing over to little Capella, who realized that she could only hear her father's thoughts, not anyone else's. This discovery was hard for her to process, given that her father had always been distant and cold toward her. It felt like some sort of trick or deception, but one thing was certain: Capella would have her revenge on him, though she didn't yet know how. With a second chance at life, Capella vowed not to waste it. She thought of Yuno, the only person she trusted, and resolved to avoid the tragic fate she had faced in her first life. When the maid took her into her arms, Capella's mind was already plotting her next steps. She had been given this new life for the sake of revenge, and she intended to use it to its fullest. A year passed, and when little Capella had learned to walk, she was already putting her plan into motion. She was constantly accompanied by a small bluebird, and one day, she made her way to her father's office, ready to begin her scheme. Peeking through the slightly open door, she watched as her father carefully sorted through some important documents. Capella knew that if the influence of the Axon family collapsed, it would plunge her father into despair, and she was determined to make that happen. With tiny, determined steps, Capella walked into the office, calling out to her father loudly, "Papa." Her words rang out with confidence, designed to provoke him. To her surprise, Corvus looked up in shock, clearly not expecting this. These were her first words, and his heart softened at the sight of her standing there with her arms outstretched. Though he tried to hide it, his heart melted at her innocent expression. Awkwardly, he picked her up, his face still wearing a grim expression, but his thoughts betrayed him. He adored his daughter. He tried to maintain his cold demeanor, telling her that she was only a nuisance, but in his mind, he was thinking about how much he wanted to protect her. After a brief moment, he showed her the door, which shut right in her face, though he couldn't help thinking about how much he cared for his little angel. Capella, who could hear his true thoughts, felt her resolve harden. Her father's love wasn't enough to erase the years of coldness she had endured. By the time Capella turned 3, she had started to show off her artistic skills. One day, as she was drawing a picture of the sun, a nanny asked her if she enjoyed the activity. Capella, with a sly smile, thought about how she would one day curse the sun she was drawing, her mind always returning to thoughts of revenge. Capella thought about a drawing she remembered from her previous life, which she had once seen in the mansion's library. She believed that if she placed it under her father's pillow, it might give him nightmares. The drawing wasn't perfectly accurate since she couldn't recall every detail, but she tried to capture its essence. The girl hoped that this would make her father sleep forever. Once she finished the drawing, Capella proudly held it up, admiring her work. The birds circling around her caught the nanny's attention, who smiled and commented on how well Capella and the birds were getting along. Capella playfully threw the bird into the air, announcing that she had named it Ruri. Without any hesitation, she dashed off to deliver the drawing to her father's room, planning to place it under his pillow. She remembered that Ruri had been with her ever since her reincarnation, though she couldn't recall the bird from her past life. Upon entering the room, Capella reached up and carefully tucked the drawing under her father's pillow, muttering to herself that no bird could stop her from getting her revenge. Now, all she had to do was wait for nightfall. That night, armed with a fork, Capella stealthily made her way to her father's room, intent on personally disturbing his sleep. She opened the door just slightly, preparing to attack, but what she saw made her freeze. Her father, Corvus, was looking at her drawing, and then he started laughing. His laughter was loud and unsettling, sending a wave of fear through Capella, as this was the last reaction she had expected. Her father, completely misinterpreting the situation, believed that Capella had drawn a portrait of him and had been too shy to give it to him directly. He thought it was adorable and laughed at how much he appreciated his daughter's effort. In his mind, he wondered how he could possibly thank her, thinking that titles and wealth were insignificant compared to the love she'd shown with her drawing. He even considered framing it. Capella, who could hear his thoughts, was horrified. Her father's thoughts were full of praise for her, though he never expressed it aloud. The loudness of his internal monologue made her headache, and she found his laughter deeply unsettling. Terrified and confused, Capella retreated, running away from the room. 2 years later, when Corvus was preparing to leave the mansion, he stood in front of the gates, explaining to Capella that he was going on a trip. She fluttered her eyelashes and gave him an innocent look, which he took as a sign that she didn't want him to go. In reality, Capella was still consumed by thoughts of revenge, and when he asked if she wanted anything, she seized the moment, saying she wanted to ride a horse. Corvus initially refused, but when she folded her hands and gave him a sweet, pleading look, he caved in. Though he tried to hide it, his heart melted, and he agreed to take her for a ride. For Capella, this was another opportunity to exact her revenge. Corvus, however, felt a strange joy in taking his daughter on a ride across the field. As they rode, Capella enjoyed the scenery, but then her father suddenly brought up the idea of finding her a groom. This news shocked her. She froze upon hearing it, recognizing that the groom in question was none other than Prince Oberon, the same prince she had been engaged to in her previous life, which had ended in disaster for her. Memories of their shared childhood, tea parties, and ultimately the tragic outcome of their relationship flooded her mind. Overwhelmed, Capella waved her arms and screamed that she wanted nothing to do with it. In her panic, her foot accidentally kicked the horse, causing it to jump and throw both of them off. Corvus, however, managed to catch his daughter in the fall. He lay on the ground, holding her tightly in his arms, protecting her from the impact. Shaken, Capella quickly scrambled to her feet and rushed over to check on her father. Corvus stood up, furious, and scolded her loudly, calling her a fool. He sternly warned her never to act so carelessly again, especially on a horse, and told her to be mindful of her safety. What surprised Capella most was that she couldn't hear her father's thoughts at that moment. Something had changed. He suddenly froze, turned away, and, with a soft tone, admitted that he had been very scared for her. He was relieved that she was unharmed. This unexpected admission confused Capella. Why, on the day of her execution in her past life, had this same man not even looked in her direction? Changing the subject quickly, Corvus returned to the topic of her engagement with Prince Oberon, asking if she truly objected to the match. Capella nodded vigorously, making it clear that she did not want the engagement. Corvus, however, didn't understand her reasons and pressed her further. In a moment of desperation, Capella blurted out that she didn't want to marry the prince, she wanted to marry her father. The words hung in the air for a moment before Capella realized the weight of what she had just said. It was a terrible idea, and she immediately regretted it. Corvus sighed, brushing off her statement as childish nonsense. But his thoughts, which Capella could still hear, were shockingly different. Deep down, he entertained the idea, thinking that he, too, wished to marry his daughter. The next day, Corvus sat in front of Capella with a grim expression, explaining that a parent cannot marry his daughter. He even went as far as asking the king about it. Capella was astonished by her father's naivety and felt a mix of frustration and amusement until he covered his face, either out of displeasure or anger. Without saying much more, he handed her an engagement certificate for the second prince. Capella stared at it, her mouth agape in shock. She absolutely did not want to end up in that situation again, having suffered through it in her previous life. A few days later, Capella found herself face to face with the young Prince Oberon. The little prince smiled at her, clearly happy to meet his bride-to-be. Capella, however, could only sigh in irritation, already exasperated by the situation. Despite his youth, she could see that he still had the same handsome features. Oberon Quasar, the second prince of the kingdom of Quasar, was known for his honesty and bright personality. In her past life, he had been her beloved fiancé, but that had all crumbled when he suddenly broke off their engagement, only to later be found dead. Ever since that tragedy, Capella wanted nothing more to do with him. Her father, Corvus, nudged her toward Oberon, but she resisted stubbornly. She had decided to momentarily put aside her revenge plans and focus on using her father for her benefit. Just then, Queen Iris Khazar made her appearance, greeting Corvus with a smile and teasing him about being overly protective of his daughter. Seeing the queen, Capella couldn't help but remember the stern, grumpy old woman from her past life. Iris had been the one who drilled manners into Capella, mostly through yelling, while Corvus had never once asked the queen to show any kindness toward his daughter. Smiling, Iris commented that today was a special occasion and no one should be judged too harshly. The young prince beamed at Capella, clearly pleased with his future bride, while Capella did everything in her power to avoid his attention. The queen invited Corvus and Capella to join them at a grand table overflowing with delicious treats. Corvus, of course, quickly followed the invitation, but Capella hesitated. Tugging on her father's trousers, Capella looked up at him with innocent eyes, declaring that she wanted to sit on his lap. Corvus brushed her off, telling her not to say such foolish things, though he inwardly thought that she was doing this on purpose to cause a scene. As Capella glanced at the queen, she was curious to see her reaction. Surely this childish behavior would make her seem unworthy of marrying the prince. But to Capella's surprise, Iris smiled warmly, saying that everything was going better than expected. The queen then asked Corvus if his daughter truly loved him that much, to which Corvus responded with measured restraint. Iris, reminiscing about their childhood, mentioned how, as an old friend, she had always worried about him. Capella recalled that Corvus and the queen had known each other since childhood. They had been close because Corvus had fought on the battlefield alongside Iris's brother, who was also his best friend. Yet, despite this connection, Capella didn't care for the queen at all, finding her detestable. It infuriated her just to sit at the same table with her. Interrupting Capella's thoughts, Prince Oberon suddenly turned to her, asking what kind of games she enjoyed playing. He assumed, with a boyish grin, that she probably liked typical girly games and drawing. Capella, thinking quickly, decided to shock everyone and declared that she loved horses. Iris and Oberon were both surprised by her response, as it was unusual for a young girl to prefer riding over more traditional activities. But Capella wasn't finished with her mischief. With a mischievous smile, she leaned forward and boldly announced that she liked to play horse. Everyone at the table froze, surprised by her strange statement. Oberon, curious, asked her what she meant by that. Capella, seizing the moment, asked Oberon to be her horse. This was all part of her new plan to alienate herself from the royal family and drive them away. Surely, after such an absurd request, they would be furious with her. To her complete shock, instead of being offended, the young prince got down on all fours in front of her, willing to play along. Capella stared in disbelief, utterly taken aback by his unexpected compliance. The queen and Corvus immediately rushed over, telling Oberon to stand up, but the damage was done. Corvus turned to his daughter, patting her on the head, and told her that such requests should be made only to her father. Internally, though, his thoughts revealed something surprising. He believed that he alone should be her horse. These thoughts caught Capella off guard, further complicating her understanding of her father's feelings. After Oberon returned to the table, he reminded his mother of her earlier statement that Capella could become his wife. He told her that, as such, he was obliged to take care of her and indulge her every whim. The queen nodded in agreement and then turned her gaze to Capella, scrutinizing her with an unreadable expression. The heroine had hoped that everything would finally conclude, but Iris suddenly turned her attention to Corvus, engaging him in a conversation about his work and completely ignoring her son's actions. The heroine couldn't fathom why the queen had abruptly changed the subject, nor why her own plan had failed. Corvus, holding a cup in his hands, mentioned that he had decided to focus on the Duke's responsibilities, attributing his choice to the fact that he was no longer young. The queen, recalling Corvus's interest in artifacts, remembered that he was only 25. Capella, ready to resort to physical action, glanced at the young prince, attempting to come up with a new strategy. Unexpectedly, the boy exclaimed, calling Corvus the Reaper of Death with a smile. The conversation immediately ceased. While Corvus's expression remained unchanged, the queen looked at her son in shock. Beaming, the prince asked if he had gotten the Duke's nickname right, stating that Corvus had earned the title during the war. Before the prince could finish, Capella staged a scene, pretending to fall and spilling tea all over the boy's face, leaving everyone stunned. Oberon sat silently, clearly shocked by the sudden turn of events, dripping wet with tea on his face and clothes. Capella felt proud of her actions, hoping that this would finally elicit a reaction. However, Iris smiled, apologizing for her son's behavior in an oddly calm manner, which seemed very strange. Even Oberon was surprised when his mother unexpectedly asked him to apologize to Capella, even though he wasn't at fault. She then suggested ending their meeting for the day. The heroine couldn't understand why they were now apologizing to her, as the queen appeared to be quite fond of her. Capella, however, was confused by how things had unfolded. She realized that events were repeating themselves, just as they had in the past. Sitting in the carriage on her way home, the heroine reflected that, at this rate, she might end up being executed again, which filled her with anger. Suddenly, her father spoke, abruptly lifting her onto his lap. She turned to look at him, confused by this unexpected gesture. He calmly explained that he did so because the carriage was shaking. This made her recall her previous remarks about wanting to sit on his lap, though she couldn't understand why he was now silently thanking her. Meanwhile, the queen was walking with the prince, clearly displeased with her son's behavior. She asked him how he had learned about the Reaper of Death. Tugging at her dress, the boy simply said that Corvus was cool. Iris began scolding him, explaining that the nickname had two meanings, but their conversation was interrupted by a knight delivering a message from Duke Ophelia. The knight announced that a new candidate for the role of saint had been chosen, which made the queen stop in her tracks. When she inquired about the candidate's name, the knight hesitantly recalled that her name was Yuno. A few days later, in the living room of Axon's house, the young prince apologized to Capella. Intrigued, she asked him what exactly he was apologizing for. The boy explained that it was for the comments he made about her father, though the heroine had long since forgotten those words. She sighed and told him that there was no need to apologize, as she didn't remember the incident. She only wished that the prince would leave her alone and go home, but he, overjoyed by her forgiveness, handed her an envelope. Oberon smiled and explained that it was an invitation to his birthday. The mention of this horrified Capella, as she had no desire to attend, but the prince insisted that it would be a fun event and assured her that she could bring her father. On the day of the party, Capella and Corvus finally arrived. Her father asked if the dress she was wearing would suit the occasion. Laughing slightly, Capella remarked that she had intentionally worn such a simple dress, hoping to shock the queen, as it was not appropriate for her fiancé's birthday. Corvus, however, didn't care. For him, his daughter's comfort was all that mattered. Still, he mused that the dress seemed to be chosen to match the color of his eyes, which made Capella upset. She hastily clarified that it was a coincidence and that she was only trying to follow current fashion trends. Corvus was surprised, as he had not said anything out loud. Smiling, he recalled that Capella's mother had also loved that color. Hearing this, Capella froze, her cheeks turning red. Corvus commented that they were quite similar and began to imagine how wonderful it would be if his beloved were there with him. Afterward, Corvus left to greet the other guests, asking his daughter to remain where she was. Unbeknownst to her, he was suddenly overcome with loneliness, though he didn't mention this to her. Capella, puzzled by her father's sudden departure, couldn't understand what was going through his mind. Corvus turned to Capella, asking if she had anything to say to him, but Capella just smiled and wished her father good luck. Once she was finally alone, memories suddenly flooded back to her. She recalled a moment from her past life when a boy had fallen and injured his knee, and a girl helped heal his wounds. That girl had been her best friend, Yuno. The same thing was happening now. Yuno was helping a boy with a wound, and people had gathered around, watching in awe. Many were seeing magic for the first time. Capella beamed with joy, remembering how happy she had been on that very day when she and Yuno first met and became best friends. In certain eras, miracle workers are born who are called saints, individuals capable of using magic that, in ancient times, only the gods could wield. Eras in which saints are born are known as times of peace. Yuno Ophelia was one such saint, and she was also Capella's best friend. Yuno had always been there for Capella, offering the love and support that her father had never provided. As Capella was lost in these thoughts, a boy interrupted her by poking her on the shoulder and pointing in the opposite direction, informing her that her fiancé, Prince Oberon, was there. Capella shyly thanked the boy, who responded with a modest smile before walking away. He seemed strangely familiar to her, but she couldn't dwell on it because something more important was on her mind, Yuno. Turning towards Yuno, Capella happily waved her arms and was about to go meet her when suddenly someone splashed a drink all over her, soaking her dress and leaving a large wet stain. In front of her stood a girl in a bright orange dress, offering an insincere apology. She claimed that her hand had slipped, and the spill was purely accidental. With a smirk, the girl added that such a simple dress wasn't even worth worrying about if it got ruined. Capella instantly recognized the girl. It was Ophelia Charla, Yuno's older sister. While Yuno was known for her beauty and kindness, Charla was the complete opposite, spiteful and arrogant. Capella vividly remembered that right after this incident in her past life, she and Yuno had become best friends. She figured that if she handled things the same way this time, everything would turn out fine again. But just as she was about to act, she caught sight of her father in the crowd. To her surprise, Capella could hear his thoughts. He wasn't just watching her, his thoughts were encouraging and supportive. He wanted his daughter to grow up strong and independent. Corvus's inner monologue was full of pride, thinking Capella should become resilient. However, to Capella, this felt like mockery. How could the man who abandoned her before her death think he had any right to offer support now? The irony infuriated her. She had no interest in hearing his so-called encouragement. Unable to contain her frustration, Capella grabbed a glass of drink, and in a fit of anger, she poured the liquid right onto Charla's dress. Charla stood there in complete shock, clearly not expecting such a bold retaliation. Capella's eyes glimmered with anger, though she masked it with a smile. She pretended to apologize to Charla, twirling her glass on her finger. Then, bending down slightly, she touched Charla's chin with her finger and declared mockingly that the expression of horror suited her much better. With an air of superiority, Capella warned Charla that she had crossed paths with Capella Axon and advised her to remember that name for the future. She promised to show her what the daughter of the Reaper of Death was capable of. Capella stood confidently over Charla, her slight smile adding to the intimidation, while Charla remained silent. Soon, the young prince, Oberon, noticed the commotion. Capella's father, Corvus, thought to himself how cool his daughter had handled the situation. Suddenly, Charla began to fake sob, claiming Capella was angry with her and insisting she hadn't meant to do anything bad. Just then, Yuno arrived, noticing her sister's tears. She asked what had happened, and Charla quickly began complaining about Capella. Panic washed over Capella as she realized Yuno had caught her red-handed. The incident was witnessed by everyone, and the stain on her own dress blended into the fabric, making it harder to prove her side of the story. Looking at Yuno, Capella was at a loss for what to do, fearing that Yuno would begin to hate her. Capella's thoughts spiraled. She remembered how, right after her birth, her mother had died, depriving her of maternal love. Now, at only 5 years old in this second life, she felt she had made a terrible mistake. Her only friend, Yuno, might soon despise her, and she'd be alone once again. But before her panic could deepen, Yuno surprised her by asking, "Did Charla say something rude to you?" Capella sighed in relief, explaining awkwardly that she had spilled juice on herself, though she knew she now appeared to be the villain in the situation. Just then, Oberon's voice cut through the crowd. He was furious, asking why his bride was on the verge of tears. Charla immediately tried to explain, claiming that Capella had spilled a drink on her dress. Capella desperately tried to defend herself, but the prince could see that Charla's dress had indeed been stained. Wanting to get to the bottom of things, Oberon did something completely unexpected. He knelt down, grabbed the hem of Capella's dress, and began to sniff it to confirm what kind of drink had been spilled. Capella was mortified by this, finding it far too much and deeply inappropriate. Oberon, however, looked up and confidently announced that her dress smelled like grape juice, proving that Capella hadn't lied. Right after this revelation, chaos ensued as the queen, who had been watching the situation unfold, became outraged. She scolded her son, criticizing him for behaving in such an ungentlemanly manner by exposing a lady's dress in public. Oberon blushed furiously and quickly apologized for his actions. Embarrassed and covering her mouth with her hands, Capella said shakily that it wasn't a big deal, though inside she was trembling, her emotions teetering on the edge. Tears formed in her eyes. Seeing this, Oberon panicked, not wanting to upset her any further. The queen stepped in, insisting that both girls change their dresses immediately and asked Corvus if he had any objections. Corvus, of course, did not, allowing the girls to go change. Later, Oberon knelt in front of Capella again, this time begging for her forgiveness for his stupid actions. Capella, taking a deep breath, replied that she had already forgiven him long ago. Now that she was fully aware of her situation, she realized she needed to act like the adult she truly was inside. After all, she was dealing with children, and children often make mistakes. Her maturity in the moment was striking, given that she had once been consumed by anger and a desire for revenge. Suddenly, Oberon jumped up, declaring dramatically that he was ready to take full responsibility for his actions. Capella, blushing, asked what he meant, especially since they were already engaged. Oberon, misunderstanding her surprise, took her hand and promised that he would make her the happiest person in the world. This reminder of their engagement and the future ahead brought back a flood of memories for Capella, memories of happier times with Oberon. She recalled moments when they joyfully rode horses together, and she realized just how much she had once loved him. But those sweet memories were soon overshadowed by the painful recollection of when Oberon had broken off their engagement in her previous life, leading to his tragic death. Yet now, standing before her was only a 6-year-old boy, and this brought a small smile to her face. It felt absurd to be so upset with such a young child. Capella explained to Oberon that she was the one who needed to apologize, expressing regret for ruining his birthday. Oberon, in turn, asked her not to worry about it. After a moment of quiet, Capella asked where the girl who had been standing with Charla had gone. Oberon, puzzled, asked if she was referring to the one who had recently been adopted. He assumed that both girls were with their parents at the moment. Hearing this, Capella made a sad face, admitting that she wanted to be friends with Yuno. Seeing her sadness, Oberon immediately grabbed Capella's hand and, without warning, jerked her forward, dragging her along with him. Oberon smiled and ran ahead, eager to take Capella somewhere. As they moved, he spoke earnestly, asking her to trust him completely. He then confessed that his mother, the queen, thought Capella was the best girl in the world and had tasked him with protecting her. Oberon explained that if a prince couldn't make his wife happy, then the people wouldn't be able to either. Capella was taken aback by his words. The boy turned to her and made a heartfelt request: if she ever felt the need to cry, she could lean on him. In that moment, Capella saw the same Oberon she had once fallen in love with in her previous life. The young prince then promised that he would make sure she never had to cry again, a personal vow. Suddenly, he stopped and apologized, thinking he had said something foolish. Capella reassured him, saying everything was fine, and even made a request of her own. Wiping away her tears, she asked Oberon to simply call her by her first name, Capella. He smiled warmly at her request and took her hand more firmly, leading her somewhere else. Capella, now filled with hope, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could enjoy her first love to the fullest this time around. Soon, Oberon and Capella caught up with Charla, Yuno, and their parents, who were preparing to leave. Oberon called out to Yuno, and everyone turned to see him holding Capella's hand tightly. Charla immediately brightened at seeing the prince, but when she noticed Capella by his side, her mood soured. The head of the family bowed respectfully to the prince, asking if there was something he needed from their family's new daughter. Oberon, without hesitation, explained that his bride, Capella, wanted to be friends with Lady Yuno. Capella was stunned by Oberon's straightforwardness, while their mother, Lady Charla's mother, let out a delighted giggle and suggested her own daughter, Charla, as a better candidate for friendship. Despite the recent tension between the girls, she still tried to protect Charla's reputation, calling her a kind child. Charla, however, was clearly against her mother's suggestion. Ignoring the tension, Capella mustered her courage, raised her head, and shyly asked Yuno if she would like to be friends. She was nervous, swallowing hard, unsure of what Yuno's response would be. Yuno looked down with an indifferent expression and then asked Capella a direct question: "Do you want to be friends with me just because I'm a saint?" Capella immediately replied, her answer coming quickly and clearly: she wanted to be friends with Yuno not as a saint, but simply as an ordinary girl. Yuno was surprised by Capella's sincerity. Moved by her response, she suddenly took Capella's hand and smiled warmly, saying she would be very happy to be friends with her. Capella's face lit up with joy at Yuno's acceptance. Soon after, the family's carriage departed, with Yuno waving enthusiastically at her new friend from the window. Meanwhile, Charla sat fuming beside her, visibly angry at her sister's newfound friendship. Their parents wore strange, forced smiles, clearly displeased about something. A few moments later, something shocking happened inside the carriage. Yuno received a brutal slap across her face, so forceful that blood trickled from her mouth. Charla stood over her, furious, accusing her of trying to get closer to the prince by agreeing to be friends with Capella. The parents did nothing to intervene. In fact, their mother smiled cruelly, remarking that if they had dressed Yuno more elegantly, perhaps she would have charmed someone. The father joined in, stepping on Yuno's hand with all his weight, causing her to scream in pain. He sneered, insisting that even mice like Yuno could be useful, as they were trying to exploit Capella's friendship to find a weakness in the Axon family. A couple of days later, Capella was busy preparing an invitation for her new friend, Yuno. She was excited and hopeful that this time, their friendship would truly blossom. Proud of the invitation she had just drawn, Capella showed it to Grace, a woman who had been helping her. Grace smiled warmly and praised Capella's work, even suggesting she show it to her father, which Capella was hesitant to do. When Capella finally presented the invitation to her father, Corvus looked it over and suggested she invite Oberon as well. He then mused aloud, wondering if she would ever write a similar letter for him. Corvus explained that Capella had only been able to befriend Yuno because of Oberon, so he believed the young prince also deserved an invitation. In front of Capella, he held back his emotions, trying to maintain his usual stoic demeanor. In reality, he was bursting with pride and happiness inside, and if Capella stayed much longer, he feared he would break into a stupid smile. Hearing his inner thoughts, Capella quickly excused herself and left the room. As she slowly walked down the corridor, Capella found herself reflecting on Oberon. She realized that he had made her heart flutter the other day, and she hadn't even fully understood it at the time. The girl suggested that perhaps it would be better if they didn't get too close. This was her way of keeping her distance from her growing feelings for Oberon. Despite any emotions she might have for him, Capella wasn't about to abandon her plan for revenge. Her focus was on preparing a luxurious tea party for her new friend, Yuno, and that became her immediate goal. On the appointed day, Capella eagerly rushed out of her room and down the stairs, excited to organize the perfect tea party. She was determined to make it a grand event, and her thoughts drifted to the treasures hidden within the family's treasury, which she believed could elevate the occasion to another level. Within minutes, Capella found herself standing at the entrance to the treasury. Desperate to get inside, she leaned her weight against the door, pushing it slightly ajar before slipping in. Inside, Capella marveled at the vast cabinets filled with all sorts of treasures. She was especially keen to use the precious tea set from the treasury for her tea party. Her hand slowly reached for one of the exquisite plates, but before she could grab it, her father, Corvus, appeared out of nowhere and pulled her away. Corvus was furious, scolding his daughter for touching the artifacts with her bare hands. He explained that handling such items improperly could cause an explosion, leaving Capella standing there in stunned silence. Feeling guilty, she quietly apologized, acknowledging her foolishness. But Corvus realized the fault was his own. He hadn't properly educated his daughter about the dangers within the treasury. Capella, sensing an opportunity, asked quietly if the plate she had reached for was an artifact. Corvus confirmed that it was, and added that everything in the room was an artifact. Capella looked around the room, genuinely surprised by this revelation. Her father, confused by her reaction, asked if she had truly forgotten what house she belonged to. Then it dawned on him that he had never told her the full details. Capella saw this as her chance to learn more about her father's secrets. She put on a sweet, innocent face and pretended to be clueless, claiming she didn't know about the artifacts. Her innocent expression tugged at Corvus's heart. Softening, he crouched down and explained that he would tell her everything. He started by asking Capella if she knew what artifacts were. She pouted, pretending to know less than she did, and Corvus explained further. He told her that artifacts were relics from the past, created through a craft called magic, a craft that no longer existed in their world. These artifacts had special powers that modern technology couldn't replicate. Capella, putting on an act, demonstrated her knowledge by explaining that artifacts had been found over the last 100 years and had various superpowers, crafted by ancient magic long lost to time. She concluded with a smile, saying that modern technology couldn't reproduce them. Corvus smiled, proud of his daughter's understanding, and confirmed her words. He added that the plate she had reached for had the ability to remove poison from food. Inwardly, Corvus thought his daughter was a genius. Then, Corvus dropped another piece of valuable information. He asked Capella if she knew about the great ducal families tied to divine powers, specifically mentioning Yuno's family. Capella immediately thought of her best friend, Yuno, and nodded. Corvus explained that the Oia family, Yuno's family, was responsible for raising and guiding saints like Yuno, while the Axon family, Capella's family, was in charge of collecting and safeguarding ancient artifacts. Together, these two families were the pillars that supported the kingdom of Quasar. Capella was stunned by this information. She had never known the full scope of her family's responsibility. Corvus gently patted her head and warned her not to get too excited, then told her never to enter the treasury again. With that, he ushered her out of the room. Capella stood outside the door, trying to process all that her father had just told her. Frustrated and confused, she screamed loudly, unsure of what her next move should be regarding Yuno and the tea party. On the day of the tea party, Capella dressed smartly and began questioning Grace about whether the sweets were ready. Grace assured her that everything had been prepared well in advance. Capella wondered aloud how the young girl knew of such a good shop where they had bought everything for the event. Capella knew that, in the past, this establishment had been incredibly popular. Their conversation was suddenly interrupted when a maid tripped and fell at their feet, breaking a vase of flowers. The maid immediately started apologizing to her young mistress. Capella offered her a hand with a smile, asking if she was hurt. The maid stammered, thinking she might have injured her hand, and suggested it might need to be bandaged. Capella then turned to Grace and asked if they had any spare flowers. Grace, smiling warmly, assured her they could easily find some replacements. Capella found Grace's warm reaction puzzling, but then Grace began talking about Capella's mother. She smiled and remarked that if Capella's mother could see her now, she would be very proud. Embarrassed, Capella tried to change the subject, redirecting the conversation back to the broken vase. As Grace was about to leave, the maid called out, mentioning that the master had said additional dishes could be taken from the treasury if there weren't enough. This greatly surprised Grace, and the maid appeared visibly nervous as she watched her leave. Capella was left deep in thought, reflecting on Grace's comments about her mother. She remembered how, in the past, she had been much angrier and more impulsive, but after everything she'd been through, she no longer wanted to hurt anyone. She gently held her pet bird, looking at it fondly, when she suddenly wondered why Grace had taken so long to return. It reminded her of when she was younger, and how Grace had suddenly been dismissed under mysterious circumstances. She had asked her father and others repeatedly about why Grace had been let go, but no one would tell her the truth, or perhaps they didn't know it. While lost in thought, a servant approached and asked if she was all right and if she wanted to return to her room. This brought back memories of another tea party long ago, when, amidst busy preparations, there had been a loud explosion that frightened everyone. The tea party was abruptly cancelled, and everyone was sent away by Corvus. Now, recalling her father's mention of explosive artifacts in the treasury, Capella began to piece things together, realizing something terrible must have happened to Grace on that day. She rushed into the building, tears filling her eyes, and called out for Grace, hoping she could protect her from whatever danger lay ahead. Capella sprinted down the corridor and finally saw Grace, who looked at her with a smile, bewildered by the girl's panic. Grace asked why Capella was suddenly yelling, explaining that the gentleman had said he would personally bring a replacement for the broken vase. She had simply been on her way back. Capella's panic only intensified. She feared that if things continued as they were, Corvus might be at risk of a deadly explosion. As Grace headed toward the vase, the man stopped her, saying he would bring it himself. She was surprised by his offer, but he explained that his daughter had recently taken an interest in artifacts, so he wanted to bring something safe as a gift. Walking away, he reflected on how he had scolded Capella the last time and was planning to offer the artifact as an apology. Corvus, meanwhile, was astonished at how much Capella seemed to understand, despite not having received a formal education. He reasoned that allowing his daughter to learn more about artifacts could be valuable, especially after Grace mentioned that her father had decided to bring the vase himself. As soon as she said this, a horrifying image flashed in Capella's mind, her father opening the door, followed by a violent explosion tearing through everything around him. Capella froze, gripped by the realization that, based on what she knew from her past life, there was destined to be an explosion in the mansion, and this time, her father would be the one to die in it. Her mind filled with terrifying visions of Corvus being consumed by flames. If she didn't act quickly, he would die. Panic seized her, and she clutched her dress tightly as conflicting emotions surged within her. Part of her recognized that if he died, her life would finally be free of the cold and cruel man she'd known as her father. But then, unexpectedly, she remembered all the moments when she'd overheard his thoughts, how he had worked hard and tried to be impressive for her sake. Processing these memories, Capella clenched her fists and dashed forward, leaving Grace standing in confusion. She raced toward her father with everything she had, unsure why he'd always been so distant, yet realizing now how deeply he'd actually cared for her. Capella ran so fast that she tumbled down the stairs, determined to reach him in time to save him. She wanted him to be the one to tell her everything, hoping that, in this life, she could find a way to stop him from hating her. As she remembered her father, bitter tears filled her eyes. She kept telling herself how much she supposedly despised him, yet here she was, risking everything to help him. Mentally, she begged him to stay alive until she arrived, because she wanted her revenge to be on her own terms. Just as Corvus was about to open the door, Capella called out to him loudly, making him turn to see his daughter. In that instant, he opened the door, and Capella, with her pet bird by her side, practically flew into the room. A deafening explosion erupted. Hearing the blast, Grace rushed in, horrified by the scene before her. Corvus lay injured but conscious, holding his bloodied and unconscious daughter in his arms. Without hesitation, he scooped Capella up and shouted to Grace that they were going to OIA's house immediately. He didn't care what demands the family might make, all that mattered to him was that the saint could heal Capella. Grace, distressed, urged him to take it easy since he too had been hurt by the explosion, but he dismissed her concerns, yelling that his own injuries didn't matter. His only priority was saving his daughter's life. Looking down at Capella, who lay limp in his arms, Corvus was overwhelmed by memories of her as a child. He realized that if he lost her now, he wouldn't be able to bear it. Then, a faint squeak came from the floor. It was Capella's beloved bird, barely clinging to life. Corvus asked for the bird to be healed as well, remembering how precious it was to his daughter. Grace, visibly shocked by his words, watched as blood trickled down Corvus's forehead. He declared that the bird was part of their family too. Grace gently lifted the small, blue creature, which occasionally showed faint signs of life, and Corvus urged her to hurry, instructing her to have the carriage prepared immediately. Just then, the butler ran in with news. The OIA family had already arrived at the mansion, so there would be no need to travel. Holding his daughter's frail body in his arms, Corvus looked silently at the man, processing the turn of events. In this life, Capella felt that everything was different. She had her bird, Rue. Grace was always by her side, helping her in every way, and, remarkably, she could even hear her father's thoughts. But despite these differences, her fate seemed unchanged. Death still loomed over her as if it were inevitable. She couldn't understand why she seemed destined for such a tragic end. If she survived, she feared she wouldn't be able to change anything, her father would reject her once again, and she would die unloved. As she spiraled deeper into these bleak thoughts, a voice interrupted her reverie. Suddenly, Capella jolted awake, sitting up in bed. The first thing she saw was her father, sitting beside her, watching her with a concerned expression as he realized his daughter had woken up. Corvus pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her close and softly calling her a sleepyhead. As he held her tightly, he whispered near Capella's ear, 3 years was too long. The girl's eyes flew open in shock. 3 years earlier, when Yuno had agreed to help heal her, Capella had focused all her strength on recovering, allowing Yuno to treat her wounds. After a while, Yuno stepped back, exhausted and covered in sweat, and informed Corvus that she'd managed to heal all of Capella's injuries. But Corvus had only one question: when would his daughter wake up? Yuno, looking down, apologized and admitted that she didn't know. Corvus gave her a sharp, angry look, causing the young girl to tremble in fear. Yuno's foster mother immediately stepped forward, pulling her close and urging Duke Axon not to frighten her daughter. Although Yuno was a saint, she was still only 5 years old. The woman reminded Corvus of his promise to them. He looked at her with a frown but said nothing. Holding Yuno protectively, her foster mother smiled and remarked that Corvus would owe them for their kindness. Clenching his fists, he reluctantly agreed. Prince Oberon was also present in the room. Corvus placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, asking him to inform his father of everything that had happened. Oberon lifted his gaze to Corvus and said earnestly that if he could do anything to help Capella, Corvus only needed to ask. Surprised by the boy's sincerity, Corvus's eyes softened. Then Lady Opilia joined the conversation, asking if Corvus himself needed medical treatment as well. He declined, turning his attention to Grace, who was carrying Capella's small bird towards them. After his daughter's life, the bird's life was now also important to him. Grace, noticing the bird in her arms, gave a nod to her adopted daughter, who immediately agreed to carry out her mother's request. When Capella finally opened her eyes, she found herself already 8 years old. Grace explained to her that she had been saved by Lady Yuno, and Capella beamed with joy, feeling a surge of admiration for her friend. But then, a new thought troubled her: how much would her family owe Yuno's family for this favor? After all, they weren't a poor family, but such a debt would be significant. Suddenly, Capella remembered the explosion and decided to ask Grace who had been responsible for it. Without turning around, Grace mentioned the girl who had dropped the vase of flowers in front of them on that day, leaving Capella stunned. She couldn't understand why the maid had done such a thing, especially since she had forgiven her back then. Capella asked what had eventually happened to the girl, but Grace, not wanting to frighten her, smiled and reassured her that her father had already taken care of everything, so there was no need to worry. Then, Grace abruptly changed the subject, telling Capella that she could ask for anything she wanted while she was still recovering. Capella's attention drifted as she slowly turned her head toward a familiar sound on the floor near her bed. Her beloved bird, Ruri, was walking around, chirping cheerfully. Capella was stunned to realize that her father had asked for Ruri to be healed alongside her. This small gesture surprised her deeply, as in her past life, when he had abandoned her, she'd never had a bird at all. Despite this touching act, however, she remained resolute in her desire for revenge. That night, as Capella prepared to sleep, she noticed her father sitting in a chair by her bedside, reading a book. Confused by his presence, she called out to him, and he looked up, his expression softening as he listened to her voice, which he had missed so much. She stared at him tensely and asked why he was still in her room. Corvus sighed, asking if there was any reason he shouldn't be there. His thoughts explained the truth to her: he had spent all 3 years sleeping in her bedroom, by her side. This revelation left Capella completely bewildered. The heroine was both touched and surprised by her father's actions, realizing that he had spent countless hours working in her room, waiting patiently by her side. Corvus reassured her not to worry, explaining that he didn't sleep on her bed, he simply kept watch over her. Capella, indignant, pointed out that sitting up like that all the time would hurt his back. Her father, with a hint of teasing, asked if she truly wanted him to lie down beside her, which only made her more flustered. She couldn't understand how he'd come to such a conclusion, while he continued to think only about how comforting it would be to sleep next to her and guard her through the night. Embarrassed, Capella stammered that maybe she could lie down beside him just for tonight. But Corvus shook his head, fearing that she might resent him if he accepted. Growing nervous, Capella blurted out that she wanted him to stay and sleep with her tonight. Hearing this, he immediately set his book aside, climbed onto the bed, extinguished the candle, and lay down, turning to face her. He wished her good night, and though Capella felt deeply embarrassed, Corvus was quietly overjoyed. Out of the corner of her eye, Capella noticed her father's slight trembling. He was still overwhelmed with gratitude and relief that his precious daughter was alive and safe. Lying beside him, Capella found herself wondering why, on the day of her past life's execution, her father had merely watched her without intervening. She blamed herself, believing she must have done something wrong, as the memory of him turning his back on her haunted her even now. Turning her back to him, Capella closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep peacefully, wondering if her father could somehow hear the voice of her heart, and how he would respond if he did. Some time later, Corvus sat at a table, sternly gazing at his instruments. In front of him sat Capella, now 9 years old, who couldn't understand what she had done to provoke such a serious expression from him. Corvus announced that they needed to discuss an urgent matter, and Capella's mind raced with fear, wondering if Prince Oberon had been killed and if she would be blamed. But her father, still fixing her with a hard stare, told her he would soon have to leave on a long business trip. He explained that for all these years, he'd refused to travel, even under orders from the king, because he didn't want to leave her alone. But now, he could no longer ignore an imperial summons. If he continued to refuse, it would be seen as treason, and this thought infuriated him. He even admitted he'd briefly considered killing the king and putting Capella on the throne. Listening to his stream of thoughts, Capella felt overwhelmed, covering her ears and crying out that she wanted to go with him, pleading for him to stop. Corvus froze, surprised by her outburst, as if he had secretly been hoping she would suggest accompanying him. Soon after, Capella excitedly shared the news with her friend Yuno, who was thrilled for her. Although Capella was stressed about the trip, knowing she wouldn't see her friend for 3 months, she cherished the bond they had formed since her recovery from the coma. In her previous life, she hadn't lost those 3 years, and it had been Oberon who first introduced Yuno to her as a friend. The prince had even proposed that the two girls meet regularly, and since then, they had grown close, meeting once a month at the palace. Yuno encouraged Capella about the upcoming journey, saying it was far better than staying at home without purpose. Capella reminded her that her father would be going for work, after all. Oberon then joined the conversation, commenting that 3 months was a long time. Capella sighed and explained that they had to make some preparations before leaving, so the trip would actually be only 2 months. Oberon gave her a warm, slightly awkward smile and confessed that he would miss her, causing Capella to blush. She tried to keep her composure, reminding herself to stay focused on the future. The prince had a brilliant idea and smiled, suggesting that once Capella returned from her journey, they should go somewhere together. The girls exchanged happy glances, agreeing that it was an excellent idea. On the appointed day, Capella and Corvus traveled together in the same carriage. She observed her father with surprise, noticing how much he had changed over the years. Sensing her gaze, Corvus looked up, assuming she might be bored. Clutching a piece of paper, he racked his brain for something interesting to talk about with his young daughter, running through various topics in his mind. He even briefly wondered if she might have a crush on anyone, but then dismissed the thought, setting the paper down and deciding on a different approach. Taking off his glasses, he asked Capella if she knew the real reason they were leaving on this journey. In truth, Corvus regretted that their conversation was starting with such mundane topics, but Capella didn't mind. She was happy to discuss anything, as long as it distracted her from her father's occasional strange thoughts. She guessed that perhaps a new artifact had recently been discovered and that her father needed to examine it. Corvus nodded, pleased by her guess, and praised her silently. He explained that artifacts were often found during excavations and that where one artifact was discovered, there were often more nearby. He asked if she understood why that might be. Capella, wearing a thoughtful expression, considered his question. She didn't know the answer, but after a moment, she suggested that maybe the ancestors had thrown everything out in one place. Corvus smiled, bringing his hand to his chin, clearly amused by her response. He explained that artifacts are considered treasures, and it's widely believed that the gods created them as tools for everyday life. According to the most common theory, the gods once lived on their land, and the areas where artifacts are found might have been their settlements, perhaps explaining why they're discovered in clusters. Capella was captivated by these stories and became genuinely curious about how the gods had lived in ancient times. Corvus seemed touched by his daughter's genuine interest. He froze, admiring her eager expression. After a moment, he collected himself, cleared his throat, and explained that they were going to excavate these artifacts as part of the king's orders, which they couldn't ignore. Suddenly, the carriage shook violently, startling Capella. Corvus immediately pulled her close, trying to figure out what was happening outside. He shouted for an explanation, and the coachman called back, urging them not to leave the carriage. Suddenly, a stone smashed through one of the carriage windows. Capella screamed, ducking to avoid the flying debris, while outside she saw their carriage surrounded by a mob. Knights were trying to hold back the angry crowd, who appeared armed and hostile, clearly harboring resentment toward their family. Corvus wrapped his arm protectively around Capella, instructing her to stay in the carriage no matter what. Then he stepped outside to confront the crowd, ordering the guards to lower their weapons so he could try to reason with them directly. One of the men lunged at Corvus, grabbing him by the collar in a fit of outrage. He accused Corvus of betraying their lives, selling their territory in exchange for his daughter's safety. Nearby, a woman clutching a frail child cried out, echoing the same accusation. The man gripping Corvus's collar kept tugging furiously as the crowd around them erupted in angry shouts, blaming him for the calamities that had befallen them. Corvus, maintaining his composure, removed the man's hand from his collar and turned to order the guards to deal with the hostile crowd. However, just as he did, another man attempted to charge at the Duke. The knights quickly intervened, blocking his path. Crying and desperate, the man demanded to know why the Duke had sold them out and abandoned them so cruelly. Corvus, however, offered no explanation. He climbed silently into the carriage, his expression heavy with guilt. Capella, seated inside, looked at him in stunned disbelief. Her wide, questioning eyes sought answers, but Corvus avoided her gaze, instead staring at the floor as he silently apologized to the villagers. He knew there had been no other way to save his daughter. Capella, still trying to make sense of the situation, understood that the village had once been under their family's jurisdiction. What she couldn't comprehend was why things had changed so drastically. Corvus finally broke his silence, admitting that the territory now belonged to the Opilia family. It dawned on Capella that her father had ceded the land in exchange for Yuno's treatment of her illness. Looking at her father with a mix of sadness and disbelief, Capella quietly suggested that everything he had done was solely to keep her alive. Overcome with guilt, she suddenly jumped to her feet and ran toward the carriage's exit, determined to apologize to the people her father had wronged. But as she reached the door, Corvus caught her arm, holding her back. He insisted that the situation was none of her concern. The desperate villagers, their faces gaunt and their eyes brimming with fury, stretched their hands toward Capella. Their outstretched arms seemed to reach for her, as though seeking revenge on anyone associated with the Duke's betrayal. Corvus, aware that his daughter had no part in the decision, quickly pulled her back into the carriage and ordered the coachman to leave immediately. The carriage sped away, leaving behind a scene of furious and disillusioned villagers. Corvus silently blamed himself for everything. Capella, her guilt palpable, lowered her eyes, staring at the floor of the carriage. Her father, too, remained silent, tormented by his own thoughts. As the carriage traveled further, Capella turned to look out of the window. She noticed a snow-covered landscape outside, signaling that they had finally arrived at their destination, the snow city of Altron. When they exited the carriage, the freezing air bit through Capella's warm clothes. Her father, however, seemed unaffected by the cold. Capella glanced at him and, realizing how detached he appeared, assumed he was regretting bringing her to such an inhospitable place. She stopped suddenly and grabbed his sleeve, surprising Corvus, who halted mid-step. The girl then asked if this snowy city was their final destination. Smiling sweetly, she declared that the city was beautiful, leaving Corvus astonished. They stood together in the middle of the snow-covered road, admiring the scene around them. Lanterns lit the streets, and tiny, charming houses lined the roads. He gently stroked Capella's hat, a small gesture to confirm her guess. Seeing her smile brightly at him, Corvus felt a wave of relief and quiet happiness. He was glad that his daughter liked it here. As they stood together, gazing at the snowy landscape ahead, a familiar voice broke the silence from behind. "It's been quite some time since we've seen you, Duke's son," the voice remarked. Turning around, they saw a man with a mustache standing before them. He greeted Capella warmly, bowing politely, and introduced himself as the governor of Altron. After greeting her, he turned and gestured toward another person. Capella looked ahead in shock, immediately recognizing the young man being introduced. It was Raquel Gorski, the boy she had met at the prince's birthday party. Extending his hand toward her, Raquel expressed his hope that he could become like a brother to her. Stunned by his words, Capella hesitated, her surprise rendering her speechless. She didn't immediately take his hand, as she struggled to process his declaration. The suggestion that he might one day be like a brother frightened her, and she instinctively clung to her father, seeking comfort. In her previous life, nothing like this had ever happened, which only heightened her unease. Corvus turned to her and offered a reassuring smile, pleased that his daughter felt safe with him. Raquel, undeterred, stepped closer and reminded Capella that they had met at the prince's birthday celebration. While Capella did remember the event, she racked her brain, trying to determine if she had encountered Raquel anywhere else. She concluded that, aside from the party, she had no memories of him in her past life. Corvus observed his daughter's discomfort and silently wished she would forget all the young men she had met and remember only her father. Turning his attention to Raquel, Corvus recalled that he had once abandoned the idea of adoption. Raquel explained that his father had a different perspective. He revealed that when his family learned of Duke Axon's visit, they had sent him to greet the Duke. Capella, overhearing this, was startled. She assumed the conversation revolved around the fact that Raquel's father had no son and needed an heir. Corvus, addressing Raquel, inquired about Lord Gorski's whereabouts. Raquel replied that his father was currently inspecting a local landmark. Corvus then requested that the governor accompany him to an excavation site. While the governor initially suggested that Corvus rest after his journey, the Duke declined, intent on leaving as soon as possible. Taking Capella by the hand, Corvus began walking toward their destination. Upon reaching the site, Corvus was informed about the details of the artifact's location. The governor pointed to a high mountain, explaining that the previous Duke Axon had already explored the area. Corvus, skeptical, remarked that it was hard to believe anything had been overlooked during the previous examination. Suddenly, Capella's voice broke through the cold silence, filled with indignation. She was upset that her father was carrying her in his arms. Corvus calmly explained that traversing the snowy mountains would be too difficult for her. Raquel was accompanying them, but Corvus cast the boy a disdainful look, making it clear he didn't want him anywhere near his daughter. Not far off, a thin, high-pitched voice rang out, catching everyone's attention. It sounded like that of a young girl. They turned toward the source of the voice and saw Charla being carried by an unknown man, likely one of her servants. Charla called out to Raquel with a smirk, a spark of tension immediately flashing between her and Capella. The tension was so palpable it felt like it might erupt into something dangerous. Capella, baring her teeth in displeasure, realized she had managed to forget about Charla until this very moment. She remembered her as Yuno's sister, a troublesome girl she had always considered her sworn enemy. The sight of Charla filled her with frustration. Charla, noticing Capella's reaction, stepped out of the servant's arms and stood tall, pridefully declaring that she was there with her father on official business. Smiling confidently, Charla informed Capella and her father that Altron was her city. Since it was their first time visiting, she graciously invited them to enjoy the place. She admitted she didn't know much about managing the territory but stated she loved the city for its beauty. Capella suddenly grew uneasy, fearing that this city might be suffering the same fate as the village her father had handed over to the Opilia family. Then, without warning, Charla turned to Duke's son, asking if he had already greeted the host. Her tone carried a hint of superiority. Corvus, still holding his daughter in his arms, bowed slightly and muttered an apology to his hostess, though he thought the gesture was unnecessary. Charla smiled and offered to join them at the excavation site, insisting that she didn't want anyone to cause trouble on her territory. Corvus glanced at her briefly and replied that they should hurry so she wouldn't catch a cold. His tone and expression were unusually sharp, frightening Capella, who had never seen her father look so stern. Charla, meanwhile, clung to Raquel, grabbing his sleeve and asking him to hold her hand. Although Raquel clearly didn't want to, he silently complied. However, as he turned his head, his gaze accidentally met Capella's. He froze in place, locking eyes with her for several moments before his cheeks turned red. Charla, noticing this exchange, grew visibly angry. Once again, as had happened at the prince's birthday party, Capella had managed to draw more attention to herself. Charla hated it. She had always been overshadowed by Capella, especially when it came to the boy's preferences. Capella, on the other hand, pressed herself closer to her father, her eyes narrowing in confusion over how everything had grown so complicated. Corvus, pulling his daughter closer to him protectively, vowed silently to keep her safe. After a while, he set her down, instructing her to stay put. He warned her that the area was prone to avalanches and that he would inspect the excavation site himself. Before leaving, he placed an unusual pendant in her hand. It was beautiful and bright, and Capella looked at it in surprise, touched by her father's care. Turning back, Corvus ordered Raquel to stay behind as well, but the boy ignored him, declaring he would follow. Capella, watching her father leave, smiled softly as she held the pendant. She thought about how deeply he cared for her and how much he tried to protect her. Her thoughts were interrupted by Charla's voice. The girl had approached her, smiling slyly as she remarked that the pendant was a nice antique. Capella turned around and, wary of Charla's intentions, asked what she wanted. Standing on the edge of the cliff, Capella noticed Charla inching closer to her. Charla's tone was sharp as she questioned whether the prince wasn't enough for Capella, accusing her of now setting her sights on Raquel. With a cruel smile, Charla declared that people like Capella deserved punishment. Without warning, Charla reached out and pushed Capella. Capella's eyes widened in shock as she felt herself falling. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The world blurred around her as she plunged down the cliff. Hearing Capella's scream, Corvus and Raquel turned around in alarm, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. Charla, ever the actress, immediately put on a concerned facade, claiming that Capella had tripped and fallen. Capella, lying on the snow below, looked up in disbelief at Charla's audacity to lie about the incident. Charla even went so far as to grab Raquel, pulling him aside and ordering him to stay quiet so they wouldn't trigger an avalanche. Suddenly, Capella's bird companion began chirping frantically, flying in panicked circles. The bird's distress wasn't in vain. Moments later, the mountain began to rumble. An avalanche started to cascade down the slope, heading straight for Capella. The ground shook violently, and Corvus immediately realized the danger his daughter was in. Without hesitation, he ran toward her, but a massive pile of snow crashed down, blocking the passage to the cave where she had fallen. Corvus barely managed to dodge the falling snow, but the way forward was completely obstructed. Desperately, he began shoveling the snow away with his hands. The mayor, watching the scene unfold, urged Corvus to call for help, insisting that they couldn't handle the situation on their own. But Corvus ignored him, frantically working to clear the snow. "I don't have time for that," he snapped, his voice filled with urgency. Stopping briefly, Corvus reached into his inner pocket and retrieved an unusual pendant. It was adorned with a large, glowing red stone clearly magical in nature. As the stone began to glow brighter, Corvus realized it was his only hope of saving his daughter. When Corvus aimed the glowing decoration at the blocked passage, the snow seemed to evaporate instantly, clearing the way. A vivid red light radiated from the artifact, illuminating the area. The mayor, alarmed, shouted that using such a powerful artifact without proper authorization could be dangerous, potentially triggering another avalanche. Corvus paid no attention to the warning. He sprinted forward, shouting Capella's name, desperately hoping to find her. But as he reached the clearing, he froze. She wasn't there. Instead, his eyes landed on a trembling pile of snow. Assuming his daughter was buried underneath, he immediately began digging. However, to his shock, he uncovered not Capella, but Charla's escort, who had shielded Charla and Raquel with his body during the avalanche. The servant stood, brushing off the snow, while Charla irritably shook out her dress and complained about how terrible the situation was. Raquel, in contrast, remained calm, though his silent disapproval of Charla was evident. Charla grumbled that if she'd known this would happen, she wouldn't have come. Corvus's patience finally snapped, his anger barely contained. Turning to Charla, he demanded to know where his daughter was. Caught off guard, Charla stumbled back, panicking. She rushed to Raquel, instinctively seeking protection, but Raquel stood motionless, clearly irritated by her actions and her presence. Charla's servant, unable to hold back, confessed to Corvus. He apologized profusely, admitting that his mistress had pushed Capella before the avalanche began. His words struck like thunder, stunning everyone present. Charla's eyes widened in disbelief as she stammered, furious that her servant had betrayed her. Before Corvus could respond, Capella's bird, Rory, suddenly appeared, chirping frantically and circling above them. The bird dove toward Corvus, tugging on a lock of his hair with its beak, as if urging him to follow. Without hesitation, Corvus followed the bird, determined to find his daughter. Behind him, Charla shouted indignantly, waving her arms and demanding that he stop. She declared that, as the owner of the city, nothing could be done without her presence. Raquel had had enough. Seizing her hand to stop her flailing, he glared at her angrily. "Be quiet, just for once," he snapped, his irritation clear in his voice. Charla, taken aback, fell to her knees, looking up at Raquel in despair. "Why are you treating me like this?" she asked, tears welling up in her eyes. But Raquel ignored her, his focus now on Corvus, who had already dashed toward the abyss without hesitation, risking his life to save Capella. Raquel smiled faintly as he watched Corvus disappear into the snow. In that moment, he thought to himself that he truly wanted to become a part of this family. Life with them would certainly never be boring. Meanwhile, Corvus followed Rory down into the snowy chasm. At the same time, Capella, buried in the snow, was suddenly surrounded by a strange blue light. The pendant her father had given her began to glow brightly against her neck. As the earth shook around her from the force of the avalanche, a protective barrier materialized around her. The light was intense and calming, shielding her from harm. After a few moments, the girl opened her eyes in confusion. She realized she was lying in the snow, completely unharmed. Nearby, the glowing barrier created a circle in the snow that looked almost ritualistic. As she stood and touched the barrier curiously, it cracked and shattered into pieces. The pendant on her neck, still glowing faintly, also began to crack. Capella panicked, clutching the broken jewelry in her hands. She feared it had been an incredibly expensive artifact, and the thought of its destruction left her horrified. "If it's ruined," she thought to herself, "our family will go bankrupt." Desperate, she began picking up the shattered pieces, examining one closely. The broken stone was breathtakingly beautiful, and Capella found herself marveling at its craftsmanship. As she stood up, the freezing air bit at her face, making her adjust her hat. She realized she needed to find her way back to safety. Before she could think of a plan, strange sounds from above caught her attention. A loud thud followed, as something or someone landed in the snow not far from her. Rushing to the spot, Capella saw her bird, Rory, circling overhead. The bird chirped happily and dove toward her, clearly relieved to see her safe. Capella smiled, overjoyed to reunite with her companion. But her joy was interrupted by a familiar voice. Turning toward the sound, she saw her father's head emerging from a snowdrift. "Papa," she cried, her voice shaking with emotion as she began digging frantically to free him. Corvus's expression lit up with relief at hearing his daughter's voice. "Are you okay?" he asked as soon as his face was uncovered. Capella, tears in her eyes, ignored his question. "Are you okay?" she shouted back, panicked at the sight of him buried in the snow. After what felt like an eternity of digging, Capella finally freed her father. Exhausted, she collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Corvus, noticing the growing darkness, lifted her into his arms, saying, "It's time for us to head back to the city." Capella blushed, clearly embarrassed to be carried again. "I don't need to be carried," she protested. "Be quiet," Corvus replied firmly, closing his eyes for a moment. "I'm not going to listen to any complaints." Despite his calm demeanor, Capella could sense something was wrong. She didn't realize he had injured his leg during the fall. Every step sent sharp pain shooting through his body, but Corvus didn't let it show. His only concern was for his daughter's safety. He silently promised himself that no matter what, he would protect her at all costs. Listening to her father's resolute silence, Capella suddenly felt awkward. She glanced at him, her emotions bubbling to the surface. In his mind, he was already considering hunting a bear to feed her, but before he could act on the thought, Capella quickly blurted out that she was fine, hoping to stop him from overreacting. The girl internally groaned, thinking how much of an idiot her father could be sometimes. Corvus, relieved but still cautious, carried her into a nearby cave, silently thanking his legs for holding out long enough to get them there. It was too dark to go any farther, so he set his daughter down and began gathering supplies to create a fire. Picking up 2 stones, he started striking them together. The girl quickly inquired about what her father was doing. He threw the burning stone onto the ground, and the surroundings were immediately illuminated by an orange flame. Capella gazed at the fire in delight and sat down beside him. Finally, the main character savored the warmth radiating from the flames. Corvus, seated nearby on a rock and watching his daughter, told her to rest well. As he stared into the fire, the man reflected on how, despite the stone's value of 50,000 lyres, his daughter was far more important to him. He was happy to see Capella warm and smiling. However, when she overheard his thoughts about the cost of the stone, she jumped up in shock. Startled, the girl apologized to her father and pulled out the necklace he had given her earlier that day, showing him what had happened to it. Corvus reassured her not to worry. He remembered that the artifact was worth 1,000,000 lyres because it was a one-time use item imbued with the royal seal, but the price didn't bother him. Seeing his daughter's well-being was all that mattered. Meanwhile, Capella was nearly fainting at the mention of such extravagant costs, but Corvus remained unbothered, thinking to himself that he would give up everything just to see her happy and safe. Despite her father's actions, Capella was unsure if he truly would sacrifice everything for her, as memories from her past life began to resurface. Raising her head, she suddenly asked her father if he loved her. Corvus turned away and dismissed her question as nonsense. In truth, though, he repeated in his mind that he adored his daughter and believed it was obvious. Capella closed her eyes, smiling. She knew that if she hadn't overheard his thoughts, she might have been upset with him. Now, however, her heart felt warm. Out of the blue, Corvus mentioned that perhaps Capella's mother would have loved her even more than he did. His words left the girl frozen in shock. Corvus explained how much his beloved had longed for her daughter's birth and how he still cherished that memory. Capella, in turn, recalled that her father had never shared anything like this with her in her past life. Jumping up suddenly, she declared that she knew nothing about her mother, hinting that she wanted to learn more. Corvus, smiling, explained that there weren't even any portraits left of her. He added, almost amused, that at first, he hadn't even wanted anything to do with her mother. He shared that his beloved had been a commoner, and their differing statuses made it nearly impossible to get permission to marry. He revealed that Capella had been in her mother's womb before they wed, which made the girl blush in embarrassment. Then, in a sudden shift, Corvus confessed that he had killed his beloved, his own family, and Capella's mother because he was the Reaper of Death.